All right, we've got Cello here. Cello has decided to go by a different name, and I think I'm going to actually let you introduce yourself the way you want to be introduced, because you're a former GM engineer, but I don't want to say too much because we haven't actually talked. We haven't prepared any talking points. We're just going to discuss General Motors and kind of the state of things. You want to just give a little background of yourself?
I'm a former General Motors / Delphi Electronics engineer, and both those entities at the time were under General Motors corporate. Delphi used to be a division of General Motors, but it spun off to be its own entity, and then eventually, obviously, went with the dinosaurs. I essentially started out as a General Motors powertrain engineer, and I was assigned to one of the four-speed automatic groups. That would be the 4L80E. For the most part, my assignment was to come up with annual updates to the transmission. That could be a multitude of things. I worked for GM Powertrain for, I'd say, 4 years, and what you're going to hear from me from the most part is I really was not happy with pretty much anywhere I was put. After being with GM Powertrain, I moved over to Delphi Electronics, and that is the connection systems part of the group. They had other divisions as well, such as a power steering division, some accessory electronics like radios, satellite radio, but I wasn't involved in anything like that. I was there for about 3 or 4 years before I decided I was not happy there either. You're going to kind of see that trend. And after that, I went to become a field engineer for General Motors. You would essentially be assigned to go to different dealerships in a region to try and find a solution to new cars that had problems that technicians were not able to solve. And I was there for about 5 years. That would be the General Motors SOP division, SPO. And that was the Service Parts Operations division. Basically, that was the group of engineers that would go around to different dealerships. That is known today as General Motors CCA, which is Customer Care and After Sales. It's essentially the same division, but once General Motors, the corporation, died around 2009, 2010, it's the general belief that they did not go out of business, but that's actually very easily researched to be incorrect. So they took a massive bailout, and they also took an even larger cut of money from China. And they developed the General Motors company as opposed to General Motors Corporation. The GM Corporation actually still exists, but it's extremely small, and all they did was essentially take existing cars and finish out their warranty period. And basically, GM, the company, took over everything else from that point on. After that, I decided I wanted to work for myself, and I became a General Motors powertrain and electronics specialist. And I essentially work as an engineer, and I like to redesign, re-engineer problematic General Motors systems and components to improve them, usually vastly, but more so for the performance automotive market, more of the kind of race-oriented world, not so much the actual, publicly driven vehicle market. I have seen that you've spoken to a few gentlemen who do work in that market, and very glad to see that. I'm very happy that there's people who are taking on the everyday driven vehicles and working on those components because they need all the help they can get.
Yeah. What's your point of view? So obviously you've seen some of the videos with Nate from Next Gen, probably talking about
Yes.
the valve bodies. And since you're, in the powertrain transmission side, what's your opinion on, do you think that when you were working on was it the 4L80, where do you think they started to, or maybe you don't think that they started to cut corners? I'm assuming you probably think they started to cut corners more and more and more, but yeah, just love to hear your thoughts on that and kind of a timeline maybe.
Certainly, absolutely. So right off the bat, they have always cut corners, the extent of which just became greater and greater as time went on. While I was assigned to the 4L80E, we would be releasing annual updates to that transmission. However, that's something that's common. General Motors did that with most all their transmissions annually. pretty much any model you look at, that was occurring to some extent. And updates were for one of three reasons. An update to the transmission could have been an improvement for a problem, although that was not terribly common. Or if it was occurring, it honestly was being done with the almost least amount of financial component possible. Other than being updates for a problem, there were updates to cut cost, and there were updates, how should I say this? I guess to an extent, there were some performance-oriented updates, but not much. Again, here for the most part, this was really cutting cost. One of the best examples I like to give people was actually for the 4L60E, which many people know there's been a history of issues that did not really seem to be resolved for the most part. There's a very popular update for people who like to replace the planetary gear assemblies from their original 4-pinion models to a 5th-pinion model. And the market generally refers to that as an upgrade, but it's actually not. It was just a cost-cutting measure. What they did is they wanted to make a less expensive planetary. They managed to do so by reducing the quality of the metallurgy and the surface treatment or surface hardening process. The reason that a 5th pinion was added was because when they created this planet with the inferior materials and 4 pinions, they were failing pretty much right away to a far greater extent than the original 4 pinions. The purpose of additional pinions is to further distribute the load of those planetary gears, and they needed the 5th pinion to make this thing actually be survivable. So a lot of guys say, oh, it's 5 pinions, it has to be better because it has better load distribution. If we had an apples to apples comparison where you had a 5th pinion planet with the original metallurgy, it would be 100% an upgrade. But being that it had worse metallurgy, worse surface hardening or surface treatment, it was actually even inferior to the original 4 pinion. GM has a lot of instances of doing that. I was talking a lot with the 6-speed guys who were creating the 6L80E, 6L90E at the same time. That transmission was in development since the early 2000s, late 90s. And as I'm sure you know, and your other guests have told you, that's actually a ZF transmission design. Ford had a model, which is going to be their 6R80 and other variants. The ZF transmission itself that was originally designed is the 6 HP series, and those went into a multitude of European cars as well as some American. Ford pretty much took the identical 6 HP ZF transmission. They cast a case where the bell housing would work with their engines, and for the most part left it just the way ZF had it. General Motors, that wasn't good enough for them. That was too expensive. So they redesigned the pump assembly, the valve body, and what's called the TECM, or the control module inside that transmission. The pump, the valve body, and the TECM are the 3 most problematic components in that transmission. So again, yes, your valve body, your separator plate, the valves in the valve body, and the pump essentially is very similar. It has similar valves that have to work like the valve body, not to the extent for shifting, but for creating pressure recovery, line pressure, cooler circuit pressure, torque converter pressures, all those circuits, very vital. And they're most importantly helpful for lubrication to the transmission, but more also on the same level, cooling the unit. So it running hot, it not having lubrication well enough to keep the valves and the valve body alive. That was a major issue with that transmission. And again, that was just all cost-cutting measures that General Motors felt they needed, and honestly just make it inferior.
From an engineering perspective, what constraints do they put on engineers? I'm sure there's subtle ways that they do it to try to, either like Nate was talking about, the porosity being, so high on these valve bodies that the metal's just constantly wearing into the valves. And you're talking about the science of the property of the metals, the purification process being terrible. And now we're seeing, in the latest news with General Motors and their crankshafts, in their 6.2 liters, they're it just looks again like less refinement, to the crankshafts and less testing going on. What sort of constraints are they putting on engineers? Because I can't imagine the engineers all want this. They're usually prideful. People that are in engineering are like, they want to build good things.
You could not be more correct. When I was first starting out with General Motors Powertrain, there were a lot of gentlemen who had been with the company and the division particularly for a long time. They really expressed to me how things had been slowly changing over the years. Annually, there's a major meeting where engineers propose their planned updates for a particular transmission. This also happens for other powertrain components like engines, differentials. But we would have a meeting. The engineers on that transmission assignment would be sitting at the table, as well as people from essentially some of the financial divisions, people who are going to determine how much money is going to be spent making changes to a transmission. That also incorporates planning how much money is going to be spent making the repairs at the dealer. A lot of thought goes into this. And generally, we would say, honestly, wholeheartedly, what we felt was needed, what we felt should be changed. And there would be a lot of back and forth over pennies because they add up substantially with the volume that General Motors produces. And we were free to really, in the early days at least, kind of propose anything. But almost always, unless a problem was quite severe, we would be told the cost is too high, give me a less expensive option. And that would go on for several tiers. Okay, that's still too expensive. Give me another option that we can save money on yet again. And let's say 5 engineers sat down at the table, they would eventually have one of us all propose a different solution with different avenues of cost. And as time went on, that would be something that they would cut back on the amount of engineers coming to the table. If an engineer kept coming up with expensive solutions, eventually they would kind of not be welcomed to enter the discussion at all.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. And we would kind of be labeled as almost a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of guys started to see that and felt they wanted to make sure they hung in there to get their pension, make sure that any of the union employees would not have to lose all the money they put into that program, which honestly happened quite a bit, especially when General Motors finally, filed Chapter 11 and finally said, there's a big issue. They also really tried to have people from GM Financial advise us to take our savings and invest it in General Motors, which a lot of us did because they matched and they made it a very attractive offer to make these investments. But a lot of guys lost everything. They were told, keep holding on, it'll rebound. But when things completely crashed, there were gentlemen who told me they had hundreds of $1,000s lost. I didn't lose that much. Fortunately, I was advised by someone outside of GM Financial, which fortunately kept me from losing a lot. In terms of that engine, I still talk to several of the engineers who were there. Unfortunately, it's most people that I have never worked with, but I still do speak with them and I still do consult for them just for outside opinion. A lot of the engineers value some of what I can offer, but they're intelligent and they all have great ideas. It's just come to a point where cutting cost is the biggest concern. As you've discussed already, there's a planned obsolescence, so to speak. After many years of General Motors experiencing people wanting to just lease a car, not keep it, and also minimize the amount of service spent on the vehicle. People really were not interested in maintaining vehicles, and that's not the entire population. Obviously, there's people who really want to keep a vehicle and do maintain it, but there was an overwhelming amount of people who would lease through GM Financial, and honestly, people who lease their cars for 2 or 3 years often just destroy them. And I mean from accidents, I mean from lack of maintenance and lack of service. So GM kept seeing this, and they finally said, if people don't want to maintain them, well, we're going to give them a product they don't have to maintain. And that slowly transitioned in from the very early 2000s to a point by, I'd say, 2008, 2009, 2010, that was in full swing with their engine oil life monitoring system, with their proposed maintenance saying, don't service your transmission for 100,000 miles, don't change your coolant for 150,000 miles. And as you know, eventually that was, don't ever change your coolant, don't ever service your transmission. And that was part of bringing in further planned obsolescence. They wanted you to have a car for 100,000 miles, have it essentially die so that they can sell you another car. A lot of people felt that they wanted you to have a car go out of warranty so that they could have dealers repair them. For the most part, GM doesn't own their dealerships, at least back then. Most were not. And GM really didn't see profit from repairing these cars. So it wasn't a big factor. My regional representative, when I was a field engineer going to dealer, told me many times, we're not interested in fixing these cars. GM sells cars. So if the dealer wanted to make a profit repairing cars, that was on them. That was to their benefit. But GM as a corporation could not care less. They just wanted to sell another car or lease another car. That was their objective. And as you can see, that planned obsolescence is just coming further and stronger than ever. Cars obviously not making it 100,000 miles.
Do you think that's changed? I think it's changed in the last 5 years, where they're going after the software industry, the subscription industry, everything they can to try to pull more revenue out of these cars. But then I also see the right to repair coming into play here, where they, you can't put your own new transmission and transmission control unit in without getting it recoded by the dealer.
Correct.
And, that does then start to funnel, I would expect, if they, can make a transmission last 100, 150,000, someone spent 30, 40,000 on a used truck, and now they have to repair their transmission for $10,000. That money's going to actually get funneled up General Motors' way.
You're not wrong. They do get revenue from customers, paying outright for parts, or if it was a transmission assembly, that definitely is a profit to General Motors. There's no doubt about that. Even so, though, speaking to many of the corporate higher ups and even some of the guys lower on the totem pole, they all pretty much said that repair is not what they're really interested in. Their bread and butter is primarily financing your new car purchase. The profit on the car outright is not all that great, but the profit they make to do your financing is great. And the profit that they make for the leases in-house is also great. So those are really their two main avenues of income from new vehicles, is that financing or that lease.
The culture of people nowadays, especially with vehicles costing what they do, it seems like people that are willing to spend $60,000 to $90,000 on these trucks, most people aren't holding them. From what I see in Facebook groups and forums, they're holding them for 2 or 3 years and then they're done, and they do it again. They just cycle.
You're absolutely right. And when General Motors many years ago was experiencing that trend growing, they honestly fed into it. Now, I can never blame the customer in this situation. It's not their fault that GM took on this planned obsolescence so aggressively. There are instances where you could have one of the GM 6-speeds or one of the GM 10-speeds, where if you actually maintained it to a far greater extent than General Motors recommends, a lot of us have seen the data and testing and actually seen these things last longer. The 10-speed and the 6-speed, not to any great extent where I'm going to say you're getting 200,000 miles out of the unit regularly. If you are changing the fluid and the filter in these every 15,000 miles with high quality synthetic fluids, I could see it happening, but without what would be considered years ago over servicing the transmission or the engine, that would never happen. The way the valve bodies are designed and the metallurgy involved, there's honestly very little possibility that there's not going to be significant amount of wear. If we look at valve bodies from many years ago, they were cast iron with a high quality steel valve, and they were also produced to far greater tolerances. The control there was far better. And generally, the circuits like the main lube circuit and the secondary lubrication circuits in these were far greater. And I'm going back to transmissions that probably were phased out in the late 80s, early 90s. when we went over to usually aluminum valve bodies, big part of that was to reduce weight, but also to change what we're using for valves. Very early on, we had steel valves in aluminum valve body. That created a lot of wear. They went to aluminum valves of different alloys, and then eventually a hard anodized valve. And hard anodized valves, when they're done well and have excellent tolerances and high quality aluminum alloys used for the valve body, they can last, they can work. And I believe Nate, is getting into that and succeeding and doing very well with it.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like he's pretty dialed on the valve body side. I wondered is there any chance that, so people buying General Motors 10 speeds now, when you look at all these trucks they sell, gosh, it's probably between 6 to 800,000 trucks, between their 1500s and their 3/4 tons. And so you're saying with the stock valve body, your chance of getting to even probably 150,000 is going to be heavily dependent on your maintenance intervals and your driving habits. If you're on the highway a lot, it's probably more likely.
Yes, you'd be absolutely correct. And the sheer amount of vehicles, as you said, it's substantial. General Motors, I don't want to call it a flagship because it's been a long time since it's been an actual flagship, but their full-size pickup, their full-size SUV lines, those trucks have been what's been keeping General Motors alive because they're cars, they're crossovers. Well, I'm going to say cars and sedans, really, they've been phasing out because they're not popular, they're not in demand. But GM hasn't had anything great to offer in that. Their crossovers were very popular when they started, but the GMC Acadia, the Chevy Traverse, those SUVs, there was also a Saturn version, a Cadillac version. They had so many issues, their first generation, that they just really soured that vehicle from their customers. Those vehicles, those Acadias, that was the number one vehicle that I was seeing for issues in the dealership when I was a field engineer. And I mean, stuff from water leaks through the windshield and the moonroof not being installed properly or sealed properly and poorly designed, to electronics issues from water intrusion and simple things, transmission related issues. The front wheel drive transmission in those vehicles were also horrendous. They were almost as bad as the GM rear-wheel drive 8-speed transmissions, just issue after issue. And like the 8-speed, they eventually abandoned it. They just gave up. They went to ZF and said, hey, we need something else. Ford and GM got a 10-speed out of it, and it hasn't been as bad. But as you can see, now that it's been out for many years, it's not great. It's really not very good.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ford had their problems with it early on because they kind of rushed it out, and then now GM has their own set of problems, and all the problems come from whatever Ford and GM customized on this transmission.
You're exactly right.
They have problems. It's like, why don't they just trust, ZF or someone
They
else?
they do, but they want places to cut money.
Yeah.
They want more, return on it. They trust ZF. We would have, not myself, but the guys who were doing the 6-speed at the time would meet with ZF engineers, and Ford was involved too, because that was a 3-way partnership on that 6-speed. And they would look at us like, why are you changing this? It's just causing you problems. We're still saving money somehow. And in the long run, they didn't, but they felt they could. And that's why they did it. And it's the same story with the 10-speed.
Yeah, the 10-speed, well, and the 8-speed prior to that. So from 2018 till now, GM's valve bodies have been terrible, and they're essentially making the transmissions it feels like everybody has a transmission problem and it's 99% valve body issues. I just don't understand how a problem can go on that long in a company and someone doesn't, a group of people, like you're saying, sitting around that table, don't say, hey, we could cut corners, but it's actually going to cost us billions in lawsuits and recalls. I mean, now they're to the point where they've got the rear wheel lockup. It's got tons of visibility. The lawyers are coming to eat. And that has to cost more than like a $10 part that they could upgrade, or a valve body that they could upgrade. I would just look at a valve body and think, how much could it possibly cost General Motors to make a better separator plate and better valves and avoid all this mess?
Well, I don't have enough financial data on that to really give an accurate and a an opinion that I trust, but just from what I've observed, when there would be meetings with someone from legal, both inside and outside, certainly it would be mentioned, as you said, cost of both a class action or even just a recall if it's a safety concern, or what GM refers to as a technical service bulletin. And that would just differentiate from a recall in a sense that General Motors doesn't feel that particular problem is a safety hazard. That's really the only differentiation. And obviously, the technical service bulletins are not mandatory. But yes, I would agree. I would like to think after so many years and so many issues that cost has to outweigh actually either a better initial design or even taking repair and upgrade recommendations from engineering. Separator plate in particular, when you have an issue, especially where you have a check ball not sealing off a circuit anymore or getting stuck in the separator plate to where a circuit can never be active again, it only takes usually an increase in thickness of the separator plate or slightly different, again, surface or heat treatment or metallurgy. And the aftermarket spins out these separator plates for all different transmissions for high performance rebuilding and applications. And they make a killing on it. And it's not expensive. I mean, I know a lot of what they're getting, even in the aftermarket, is coming from China, which is sad. I wish there were more American options. Something I hear Nate's doing, which is great. But companies like Transgo or Sonex, who make solutions, they have stuff made in India and China, sadly, but it works very well. It blows my mind that when a problem gets this big, that they don't just bite down and do it. It really does.
Were there metrics that they had where it's like, well, if we have 10% or 15% failure rate by the time warranty's up, that's acceptable? Were there clear-cut metrics, or was it always kind of hush-hush and it was all
So
just
there are absolutely tons of metrics. The transmission I was assigned to, honestly, was one of the far better performing and less problematic transmissions. So I didn't get to see a lot of that compared to my contemporaries who were working on 6-speed. And then when I left General Motors, I didn't really get to see any of those financial metrics at all on the 8-speed or the 10-speed. But yeah, they have the information, they have the data, and a lot of the engineers do get to see those metrics. They're important for the engineers to recommend updates or upgrades or absolutely needed repairs and redesigns. So yes, they are aware. They do get to see some of the metrics. I'm sure not to the extent that they would like to, but they definitely do.
Yeah, I wonder, man, I would love to know what percentage of when I look in the groups, especially those Facebook groups where you see, folks having these valve body issues and they say, oh, there's 4 trucks ahead of mine or 8 trucks ahead of mine at the dealer, and they know they're not getting it back for a while. I just wonder how many are truly failing. And it's hard to know because they sold so many every year. And it's obvious they're just putting the same thing back in and getting them through warranty.
They are in a lot of instances where there's a problem and we're not redesigning a component or redesigning the way that component operates. You're correct. They're just putting the exact same components back in and they're letting that start fresh, and it's in their mind, okay, well, if it lasted 60,000 miles, we can put the exact same stuff in and have it last another 60,000 miles. And that goes twofold because one, yes, it does get it through warranty and the customer is somewhat happier that they have a better working vehicle, but they want that planned obsolescence still, that it'll fail again, go out of warranty, and hopefully sell that customer a new vehicle, have them abandon theirs.
I'm always surprised that the sales numbers aren't affected by things like this. And people still buy, I can remember converting from General Motors. That's all I had was a ton of General Motors Yukons and Yukon XLs and trucks. And my dad had GMC, and I converted because of these problems and electronic problems. I was like, I can't stand it anymore. 90,000 miles, I'm having crankshaft sensor position issues and just all sorts of problems. And I got sick of it, went to Toyota and kind of never went back. But I just don't understand why more people don't leave, I guess, as far as just customers, just voting with your wallet.
Their sales numbers have absolutely suffered. However, they still do sell such a volume that it's not apparent to a lot of the customers or people in the market to buy vehicles. But those trucks, those 1500 through 3500 series pickups and SUVs, that was GM's flagship vehicle. And for the longest time, they were built quite well and got a good chunk of change to be given to engineers, both the initial design engineers and the repair engineers on both aspects, to keep those vehicles running well. But they did eventually suffer. When we started to see GM's flagship vehicles suffer and have problems, we all said, okay, this is it. If they're letting their most important vehicles have these issues, then there's something seriously wrong. And I'm glad to hear that you moved to Toyota. Toyota's had a great record of having many excellent products. Several brands have. I mean, there's been certain vehicles from Subaru that have been great, and so many other manufacturers. And I'm glad, in a sense, to hear that some people left General Motors. I was always hoping that more would, because there's so many other good vehicles. I mean, for so many years, unfortunately, now a lot of those brands are suffering too, in a lot of ways, not to the same extent. But I hear from some contemporaries who have a lot of European cars, whether it's BMW, Mercedes, who are having significant problems as well. And I mean, I see that in the Asian market as well, just not to the same extent. And I feel like a lot of people are afraid, in a sense, to change to something else for fear of having problems with that particular vehicle as well. I feel that the customer base has kind of been soured in a lot of ways towards buying new vehicles, period.
Yeah,
I'm hoping.
everybody. It seems like the sentiment is, from what I see so many comments of that saying, it doesn't matter what you buy. They all have their problems. Pick the one you want. Pick the one that looks the nicest to you or that rides the best, whatever it is.
Yeah, but while you're absolutely correct, those are two things that the customer base still values sometimes over the potential for issues.
Yeah.
No, I want a great looking vehicle, or a great riding vehicle, or a vehicle that has particular subset of options, whether it's air conditioned seats or, many of the electronic issues that are in vehicles today. You
Massaging
can,
seats.
yeah, I mean, it's there. You almost cannot buy a new vehicle that has electric power accessories. All the power accessories today are electronic. You
Yeah.
can't get a simple electric power window system or power lock system that has no electronic operation. Control modules and electronics are all parts of these systems today. And when you have a problem with a control module and you can't open or close your windows, or can't unlock or lock your doors, and move your seats, or use your instrument panel, your gauges, your air conditioning, I mean, it's just overcomplicated things to the point where we could have electric systems and have all these things work and last.
Do you think that I have this theory that I used to work on BMWs all the time, just in my garage, and I would flip them,
Nice.
and because they were terrible. And it's interesting that a lot of the problems I saw from the 2000s, the kind of early 20 teens BMWs, it's like all the American and Toyota are now venturing into that, like, highly complicated CAN bus systems, and now they're having all the same problems BMW used to have, which is what made BMW so, in my opinion, but it was like, this is what makes this car unreliable, is this, CAN bus fiber optic system that goes from front to back. And it's like, I don't know. I just think it's completely unnecessary for a car to diagnose it. But
You're absolutely correct. But this is one of the topics where we start to get into government regulation in terms of safety. And, there's also obviously emissions components, but not to this in particular. But these high speed networks, which started out obviously as a serial bus and then going to CAN bus, General Motors, for example, has high speed, low speed, and LAN for their CAN bus system. Everything now is going to a traditional local network, just like for your home computers or servers, where everything is going to work on an actual Ethernet based LAN network for higher speed interconnectivity. And that has grown to that extent, partially from government oversight and regulation, especially the high-speed networks. They want to make sure that the electronic brakes, electronic traction control, the engine, transmission are all on a extremely high-speed network. Oh, excuse me, also the supplemental inflatable restraint system. For safety reasons, for crashes and accidents, they want those to be communicating as quick as possible to try and protect the occupants and protect the vehicle. Having these other control modules end up on that network to me is a complete waste. And they've been slowly transitioning to faster and faster secondary networks for the, like we said, a driver's door control module or body control or, anything outside of electronic brakes, suspension, airbags, engine transmission. But the government has, to an extent, requirements for all the safety related subset systems. And obviously, they get involved in the emissions control systems as well. Right now, GM's V8s and Chrysler's V8s, with their cylinder deactivation, that's in a huge part because of emissions and government oversight. Trust me, we don't want those systems in these vehicles. Having these engine failures now with something that started out in the early 2000s as 4-cylinder shutdown and having 8 lifters involved to now all 8 cylinders being in that system and having all 16 potential lifters be involved and fail. The guys from some of the powertrain groups that are working on that engine, they don't want these systems. Even to an extent, GM doesn't want them because of the issues and expense. But unfortunately, they're not going to go anywhere because of CAFE and other government oversight.
Yeah, I mean, to delete a DFM solution is such a nightmare. It's like, why buy the engine if you're going to go delete it, in my opinion?
I agree.
It's you got to tear it down so far, get the lifters out to truly delete it properly. And then now this, it's weird how the psychology is changing of people. I see people saying that my truck's been really reliable. I made it, I'm at 30,000 or I'm at 60,000, no issues. And I'm just thinking, wow, has the goalpost moved from, 200,000 was a reliable car to 30, 60, 70,000. And that's what it seems to be. People are really seeing that as a milestone. Like I haven't had a single issue. And when they hit 100,000, it's like you hit the gold mine now.
You could not be more correct. The bar has been lowered, and it's so sad. I discuss with my contemporaries to look at older vehicles from all different makes and models. Find an older vehicle that you like, hopefully with less complexity. Get it into good shape and maintain that thing, and it'll last. I mean,
Yeah.
200,000, 300,000, 400,000 without issue. On the newer engines, things like direct injection, something else that's government oversight, CAFE regulated. We don't want it in our engines. We don't want that system, period. It's honestly, it's filthy. The carbon and oil buildup in the intake tract, it's disgusting. At 50,000 miles, if you looked at the back of the intake valves, they're so restricted that the engine is down significantly on power. People who don't drive the vehicle aggressively probably would never notice, except that the idle characteristics eventually change. And eventually there's enough misfiring at some point for a check engine light. But otherwise, a lot of people are oblivious to it based on their driving habits.
Yeah.
And I feel a lot of the people, as you said, are saying, oh, I haven't had any issues at 30,000 miles or 40,000. It comes down to their driving style. Or potentially they are doing slightly more maintenance than is recommended, because at that point there's almost no maintenance recommended.
Yeah, they do walnut blasting. I know on Audis they have a 30,000 mile service, and it's just normal for people to spend $1,200 to have your valves walnut blasted. It's like that's not $1,200 for a maintenance item it's getting crazy. I just think the society's kind of losing their mind, and the fact that people spend it is more crazy to me. But
Well, it is crazy to me as well. However, some of these manufacturers have engineered, so to speak, or created a scenario where their customers, their clientele, expect these high maintenance fees for some vehicles. And it's good and it's bad. I'm not particularly fond of something like the Shell media for that particular service for a vehicle that has their engine put together. That's a media that's definitely used on engine components when they're disassembled. I think some of the more chemical oriented treatments, both spraying that treatment directly through a fully open throttle body or running it through the fuel rail, disconnecting the fuel source from the fuel pump to the fuel rail, removing that from being able to feed any fuel to the engine, and just running it almost like an IV bag, so to speak, but with a small pump to the rail and running that cleanser through the injectors or, again, through the throttle body and in conjunction oftentimes. But once you chemically break down that stuff, running the engine to evacuate it, it's nasty. It's not good for the piston rings. It's not good for the oil because that stuff gets past the rings at some point and into the oil. The vapors in the crankcase are quite nasty when they're not evacuated through a crankcase ventilation system. And a lot of people don't maintain that system. It gets clogged off. That actually makes your oil last far shorter, especially when you're being told don't change it, follow your oil life monitor, which is a complete disaster, honestly. But it's another way of planned obsolescence, believe it or not. Everyone's knows that these things occur, and it's just, nope, not a problem. We're going to ignore it. Put blinders on.
And we do direct injection and then we turbocharge it. That's the awesome part. That's everything's turbocharged DI on these 4 cylinders and 6 cylinders.
It is, but there's been, at least with General Motors that I've seen, the return of some port fuel injection. And I don't mean solely, I mean the direct injection is there, but then there'll be secondary fuel injectors that are traditional port electronic injection to periodically wash down the back of the intake valves. And that's been a benefit. That was tested with Corvette quite a long time ago. But Corvette has been somewhat of a testing ground for a lot of GM's technologies. So that's expected to be seen in more of their vehicles, especially the V8s coming soon. And it's not a solution because the direct injection really needs to go, but it is a benefit. We can't get the fuel economy without the direct injection. Direct injection just saves on fuel, and there is some benefit with emissions. People used to think that direct injection itself produces more power than a traditional electronic fuel injector. You know, that's something you'll hear often. It factually does not, only because what you're hearing is a partial statement. The direct injection creates more power per volume of fuel. And that's solely because it consumes and uses less fuel to operate. All in all, a traditional port injector can support and produce more power, bar none.
I've heard that too, that the port injection, when you have port and DI, you actually have better low end torque due to the port injection. But I noticed Toyota, I watch a lot of other channels like the Car Care Nut, and he tore down that V6 from Toyota, 3.4 liter twin turbo direct injection, and it has port injection as well. And he said he's seen it multiple times on their DI engines that have port injection. He said they're still kind of a carbon mess, even around 40 or 50,000 miles. It looks like they're still gumming up pretty bad around the valves. So I still don't think that port's going to solve all of our issues, not compared to the old, where you just had straight port injection. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's not. But again, that's in part because of CAFE and government oversight. So those vehicles have to primarily run on the direct injection. And that's the main issue. Really, what this offers with the strategy for the traditional port injectors, they're not used to a great extent, and that's by design. We could change things to make them used to a greater extent, which would be beneficial to the engine, but it would kind of cause other emissions type of problems. The direct injection has its own associated emissions problems. You may recall quite a few years ago, Volkswagen got in trouble for essentially trying to falsify the emissions reported for their vehicles. And that stemmed primarily from direct injection and not having those intake runners, ports, valves cleaned. That creates its own subset of emissions problems. So it's something that we could really improve quite substantially if permitted to use those port injectors to a far greater extent. But I don't think we'll ever see that just because of the regulations in place.
If you had to buy a truck, a half ton or a 3/4 ton, what would you buy?
Oh man. I could not buy a relatively new truck. I mean, especially what the diesel market has suffered now with emissions control devices. So I'm someone that would need a diesel for towing. I like to tow my race car, my drive about fun street car, out to, road courses, circle tracks, the drag strip, and I need to tow. And the diesel market has suffered so much from all of this, far worse than the gasoline engine market. And the gasoline market is doing quite poorly. So if you haven't researched that diesel market all that much, it's really quite bad.
Yeah.
I honestly would have to go back to an older vehicle. I try and find something that doesn't have any frame rust or rot, something that doesn't have terrible body rust or rot. Get both of those in great shape, replace all the, I'm sure, rotted out brake lines, fuel lines, etc., and find a truck that doesn't have too much overly control module operated systems. And I'd get something probably early 2000s possibly, and just maintain or fix everything I can pretty much powertrain wise, which usually isn't much. And I'd go that route. I couldn't do a new vehicle. What have you heard from other people? I'm curious.
It's tough because a lot of people I talk to are other YouTubers that are buying brand new trucks all the time because they get a write-off. So they Section 179 the write-off, and that's
Sure.
they just want to save the money and they don't want to pay the government. And I understand that, but I just keep holding the line of like, I just don't want to support this trend. And so I think people are getting to be apathetic about the whole situation. They're like, well, what do I buy? They don't want to buy something that's out of warranty. Most people can't fix their cars like I can, and they just don't want the hassle. So they buy something that's in warranty and they risk it. And they say, well, I hope I'm not one of the 10 to 15% that have a catastrophic problem. And if I'm not, great, then I'll cycle it at 60,000. That's what I see people doing all the time. And they just roll negative equity in every time they go to the dealer.
You're absolutely right. And it hurts me to see that. But that's really where things are going, especially with vehicles where you've had a huge client base that is just leasing and accustomed to just getting rid of the vehicle in 3 years. They're almost creating, in that sense, a disposable car market, and it's quite sad.
Yeah. It's driven used car prices up. I've noticed since I think there's been a lot more videos like mine recently in the last couple of years on YouTube and other formats, people kind of blowing the whistle on this whole trend. And that has been driving up used car prices, especially for Toyotas. I mean, you see, gosh, I was looking for a 4Runner for my son, a 2010 4Runner with 220,000 miles on it cost minimum of $13,000, which is crazy.
But that was a great vehicle, honestly.
Yeah.
Um, I
5-speed.
would absolutely take something like that because they were, in my opinion, one of the last great products, especially from Toyota, who we can both agree has had a stellar reputation in the past. I mean, Toyota really wanted to come into the American market many years ago, and in a sense do their best to take it over. And I applaud them. They really created quite a few excellent products. I would take a truck like that. I'd go back even further to a cruiser. Those were also great trucks, for a great span of time too. I mean, have you ever had like a Land Cruiser?
I have not. No, I've only I've seen a couple for sale around here. Most of them get, they were so susceptible to rust, along with those older Forerunners and everything, that you really got to be careful. And the FJ Cruisers, I've always kind of liked the looks of those just for a interesting vehicle, but they tend to get rusted out pretty fast. Although in Colorado, if you can find one, in Arizona, Colorado, if it's lived there its whole life, you can get lucky sometimes.
You're absolutely right. There are areas of the country, like you said, where you don't have major rust or rot issues. Those are great places to try and find an older vehicle that's got a solid frame or a solid body, and those are great vehicles to take on and do whatever minimal restoration you needs and have a reliable vehicle for, God knows how long.
Yeah, there's a reason I still see 2000 to 2006 ish GMC trucks still running around with 300 or 400,000, and contractors, handymen using them still. And,
Yeah.
and boy, there's other ones that are newer that are in the junkyard already.
They are. So when I advise friends and contemporaries on that General Motors, what they referred to as their C/K platform, 2006 was the last year of probably one of their best, model groups.
Yeah.
2006 was the final year for the Tahoes, Yukons, Suburbans before going to the new platform. So that was their, GMT 800 platform. In 2007, they went to their GMT 900 platform, and that's when things started declining. That was the first year that they went to a 6-speed transmission and a substantially larger amount of control modules. That's when things kind of really tipped for that, what GM still would consider their old flagship.
I know what I was going to ask you too. I noticed a trend in transmissions across the board where, and I've heard people claim, and I don't believe it. They claim that, all the new fluids are just so advanced they can handle all these crazy high temperatures and all these transmissions. And I see people with new Toyotas, new Tundras, Tacomas, whether it's, new GMCs, Fords, and they're all lacking transmission coolers. They're all running, when they're towing, 240 to 280 degrees. And I'm just thinking that is going to fry that thing so fast. And my old Sequoia, it's a 2008, has an external cooler on it, which they removed in 2010. And that thing runs, when I'm towing up the worst passes in the country, it'll run at 200 to 210 degrees max. So with a full load, full cargo, full trailer, everything. I don't know. What do you think about, I mean, is that just another cost cutting measure and just something that, hey, we can remove that external cooler and it saves us $15?
That's definitely a cost cutting measure. And that's probably one of the worst things you can actually do. Keeping these different fluids within a certain temperature range, I feel, is ideal for longevity. So the vehicles as a whole, from all manufacturers, have been moving in the direction of higher temperatures for both engine coolant, engine oil, transmission fluid, everything for many, many years. And one of the best things you can do for a vehicle is to make changes to those systems to bring all those temperatures down. Coolant temperature, ideally around 180, ideal. Transmission fluid around 160, 170, ideally. Engine oil, we need to get up past 212 degrees to try and remove moisture that accumulates in the oil, but we don't want the oil running that hot. We just want it to reach that temperature, and then we want to bring it back down, probably closer to, again, 180, 190, maybe 200 at the most. And we do that with aftermarket components. So larger coolers, but then also an inline thermostat for the lines that go to these coolers. Obviously, the engine has its own thermostat for the coolant, and it's easy to go to a thermostat operating range that's lower. But for the transmissions and engine oils, we have to go to the aftermarket to get an inline thermostat for those systems, which if you're going to add a cooler to either, I highly recommend. That way those fluids can warm up to operating temperature without the cooler affecting temperature. And then once we've reached it, those thermostats will open and maintain our temperatures. In terms of those fluids, though, there has been actually a fair amount of improvement in quality of, for example, ATF, but the manufacturers are not really using them. For example, General Motors changed from Dextron 3, I believe they went up to H, to now Dextron 6. And just going to a semi-synthetic or a full synthetic was a good improvement. But there are transmission fluids that most of these manufacturers offer that they're not using in their vehicles. General Motors, for example, with their Allison division, their Allison transmissions, such as the 1000 series, that's a 6-speed. When Dextron 6 was available, they said, no, that fluid's not good enough. And they created their own subset of fluids. For example, the Allison TES 295 is somewhat of a variation of Dextron 6, but with actually improved aspects in several ways. So there are fluids that have been improved. They're just not being used. You have to go to the aftermarket or like in GM to an Allison grade fluid.
Okay. So they're better fluids, but not good enough to warrant the temperatures that they're allowing everything to run at.
That's correct. They should not be run at those higher temperatures. And like you said, something like an external cooler, really is something that they should invest the money in. Sadly, they're not. So as a customer or an owner of that vehicle, I recommend to everyone that's something that you should try and address. If you want to keep that vehicle, that's something simple you can do in addition to, more frequent service intervals that you can do to keep that vehicle going.
How do you think tariffs are going to affect all this? Do you think it's just going to drive quality down even more because the cost of domestic manufacturing is just slightly more expensive and they'll just cut corners even more?
I'm afraid so. I know that a lot of, let's refer to them as parts suppliers, and I mean the people who are actually creating parts for a manufacturer. Let's say a group of companies that are producing parts for General Motors, they have imposed increased fees and what they were actually referred to as tariff fees for quite a while now to, in a sense, pre-plan for this. And I've been paying some of those tariffs on a lot of parts and components that I use to make what I need to upgrade these vehicles for probably about a year now. So I do agree that there probably will be further diminished quality, but these companies have been aware and planning for these tariffs for quite a while now. And they're just going to use it as an excuse at this point because most people don't know that they've already been paying higher prices, planning for this.
Man, the used market's going to get even worse, I suppose.
It must. Yeah, it must.
In the sense that, all the old Toyotas and everything are just the price is just going to keep going up on old reliable vehicles, whether it's old GMs, Toyotas, whatever they are. People will find those kind of diamonds in the rough, the years that were good and the transmissions that were good, and they'll shoot through the roof.
No, you're right. And there are some people who will say, I want to buy a Ford, I want to buy a GM, I want to buy a Chrysler, any of the big three to be American or support America. The issue with that is, for example, when GM became the GM company, as opposed to the GM Corporation after the financial crisis, General Motors stopped producing in-house parts and components. For years, they had their own foundries to cast engine components, transmission components. Through AC Delco and their internal vendors, they produced all the parts they needed, whether it was brakes, shocks, struts, electrical connectors, sensors, that stuff came from Delphi through AC Delco. But now GM produces nothing for themselves. Everything is made by another company and imported. So, for example, Akebono Brakes, a Japanese company, is the supplier for GM vehicles on brakes. They've gone to Denso, Bosch, a lot of these German suppliers. Pretty much nothing on your American vehicle is American anymore. You have more American built components on foreign cars like a Toyota. So you're being more American buying from someone like Toyota. It's really a shame. Things like, wiring and connectors used to be from Delphi. GM had the best electrical connector company in the world. And they just decided in 2010 that using Delphi stuff was too expensive and they're going to outsource everything. They're going to go to Molex or Yazaki or any of the Japanese vendors, which is decent stuff. Don't get me wrong. Both those companies like Yazaki, they make great products. GM's just not buying any of their better products. They're getting whatever cheap stuff they can get. And it's really sad, especially from a company that thrived on being one of the greatest electrical connector companies. That was the time pretty much where I was leaving Delphi. They said, no, we're not going to use Delphi components anymore. Just way too expensive. And most of the components on the vehicle today, they're just made by a foreign company. GM doesn't make any alternator parts. Same thing, no power steering, although it's going to electric power steering now, but nothing. They produce nothing for themselves. And the stuff they do get really isn't usually American. It's rather sad.
Yeah. I see a lot of other people making excuses for them, like, well, it's supply chain issues or it's manufacturing. You can't expect them to just have these parts in stock. I'm like, what? First of all, we can expect them to get through warranty. Second of all, we can expect them, if they're going to build subpar products, to have them in stock, and they don't. And that's probably a big reason why is they don't even control the supply chain for any of this stuff. You got this parts going into brand new vehicles being assembled in Mexico or wherever and being sold as an American truck. And then when they break down, people are down for 2, 3, 4 months at the dealership because they can't get the part. It's becoming a huge, huge problem for some people. But unfortunately, there's still a very vocal set of people that benefit from things, especially on YouTube. They benefit from getting press cars and being flown around to these deals and getting early access to things that they'll just keep championing their products, and that's their bread and butter. And I don't see it changing unless this number, the percentage of people that have problems maybe gets up around, I don't know what it is. There's got to be a breaking point, like 20 to 30% of cars are failing before warranty. Then maybe something changes. Maybe something turns around. I don't know what the number is. There's got to be some point, though.
I couldn't agree with you more. They definitely do not control the supply chain to a decent extent, especially now that they're not producing their own components and parts anymore. However, there definitely are situations where a car might be down at a dealership, even for a short time, but the vehicles that are tied up there for a fairly long duration, they're often saying there's no parts availability, just as you've heard. However, that's not actually true. So there almost always are parts available, regardless of what customers are being told or dealers are being told. A lot of times the dealer isn't being told the truth either. Now, General Motors produces parts and then separates them into two categories. So they create parts that go to new vehicles only, and they create parts that are for repair only. And they differentiate them in fit and finish quality. So let's say they just produced a water pump, and the water pumps that come out with better either casting or machine quality, that operate better in terms of flowing coolant or creating coolant pressure, these are the parts that get separated and put in new cars. The parts that don't quite meet that high spec then get separated to go to parts counters or warranty parts. And they're not defective, they're not bad, they're just not the top tier of part. Almost anything or any market where parts are created, the parts are always put into tiers in terms of how they came out, how, fit, finish, again, performance. They're always separated. I mean, this occurs with computer parts, for PCs, automobiles, most anything, appliances. This occurs. It's just the norm. But getting back to what you were saying, they do have parts available, but they would have to pull them from the new car parts line. And they don't want to do that. They don't want to disrupt their new cars being assembled. They don't want to have a shortage of parts there. But if they absolutely needed to get a part, they could. They just won't.
Wow, I didn't know that they were basically putting this the lesser quality parts down to the warranty repair. That's crazy that they're actually parsing it to that level.
Yes, but like I said, that's almost any manufacturing for most anything. It's not like it's a GM thing. That occurs with most all car manufacturers. And again, other other things like appliances and computers and most anything. That's just the norm.
Yeah, so I guess the people out there that say, "Well, I'm not too worried. I'm under warranty." Well, just keep in mind you're getting your warranty part is probably not going to be as good as the original. So
In most cases, yes, and it may not be too much of an extent, but that is absolutely the case.
yeah, just maybe something slightly out of spec, but it's good enough.
Yes,
Get them
definitely
to warranty. That's the name of the game.
they are, and again, that's because they just want to sell cars. My district rep, while I was working as a field engineer, would constantly tell me, "Where GM is here to sell cars. We don't care about fixing them. That's dealer's prerogative because the dealer sees much more financial gain from it than General Motors does. They just want to move more cars. There have been times where I had a car that was down for like a month at a dealer somewhere, and the owner of the car or the person leasing it would be calling corporate, and they don't get to talk to any real corporate person, but customer service at corporate. "Oh, my car's down forever. Can you help me? Is there anything you can do?" And they'd say, no parts available. But as I told you, if they really wanted to get a part, they absolutely could. Just have to come from the new car, parts line.
Yeah.
It's sad.
A lot of folks have these intuitions that a lot of this stuff's going on, but you don't really know until you talk to people on the inside. And then, people still working there, I think, at least I hear it from other people that claim they have contacts with engineers at GM, and they battle me all the time and say, that's not what it is. These engineers spend so much time testing this stuff. And I'm like, I don't doubt that they're devoted to their jobs and that they really want a better product. It's just that they don't get to decide how much is spent on that part or how much is spent on testing, and the data and the outcome doesn't, you can't fake it. You can't fake quality. You can't fake reliability, and the truth will come out. If it doesn't make it 100,000 or 200,000 miles, well, there you go. It doesn't matter what they say. It's just, look what's going on.
Again, you're absolutely correct. So everyone I've worked with, in engineering, both in design engineering, which means we're creating something for a new vehicle, or in repairs, which means we're just designing a part to replace something that's failing or whatever it may be, designing something for a repair or a service. We do want to make the best thing we can. A lot of us are proud and want to make the best part or the best software or programming or whatever it is we're working on that we can. But pretty much the penny pinchers shut us down. Most everyone I know really did a great job doing what they were permitted to do. But when you constantly tell an engineer or anyone, even technicians, that you're not able to do the best thing for the vehicle or the best thing for the customer, you have a ton of turnover. And I would see it all the time. Just engineers leaving the company altogether or changing to a different division. I mean, just as I did, I kept becoming unhappy where I was and saying I want to leave. And they said, "Okay, well, how about we try you at Delphi, or how about we try you at service and parts operations instead of powertrain. So I tried that twice. I said, okay, I'll move. I'll see if it's better, but it never was. So eventually I left. And like I said, there's just a ton of turnover with most everybody, even the corporate employees. They get fed up with being told, no, we're not going to do what's best. We're going to do what's affordable. We're going to do, what's available. It's very frustrating for everyone.
Well, it's been enlightening. I do appreciate you coming on here. And is there anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap it up? I know I've kept you on over an hour, which is a long time.
Well, I'm happy to try and offer you any insight I can. There's probably many things we could discuss. I just hope that what I've offered you thus far benefits you and at least points you in a good direction for you to do your own research or speak with others. I think it's really sad when you have to speak to an engineer that's still employed who can't really tell you what they want to tell you or tell you that things are fine or whatever it is. But people want to keep their jobs, unfortunately, and get put in a situation where they're stuck telling you what they tell you. I thank you for offering me a chance to kind of tell you what I've experienced and what I've seen. I hope, again, that something I've given you has been beneficial.
Oh yeah, I'm sure people will love it. Yeah, and I always put it out there to the audience. If you guys have any questions, there's always a chance to bring you back and answer questions. I did that with Nate a couple times, and I just look at the questions, and there's always interesting questions from people watching the video and commenting. So it's always fun to see the comments and think, oh, I wish I would have asked that, and then have kind of aggregate the good comments and questions, and then come to a follow-up video, because it's rare that people get to talk to anybody on the inside. And if they do, I actually have family members on the inside, but I don't talk to them about it specifically because I don't want to put them in a bad position. Family member that works in GM engineering has for his entire career, and I specifically will not bug him because it's unfair to him.
No, that's very understandable. I can completely appreciate that. My late father was also a engineer for General Motors in his youth, and then became a corporate employee, later on. And a lot of this really broke his heart because he was a General Motors diehard. Specifically, he was a Buick Motor Division diehard when all these divisions were relatively separate and not so much this massive entity. But yeah, I can appreciate that. Definitely. If someone has questions, or if you can think of anything you want to ask in the future, I'm more than open to talk to you again. Or there's any other, subsection of GM vehicles or components that you'd like additional info on, or info that we didn't cover, as well as anything that, I've been designing or creating to kind of correct these issues. I know you talked to Nate quite a bit about that, at least with transmissions. I do that for the entire powertrain, as well as electronics and electrical systems.
Okay. So you do aftermarket fixes for things that are problems for the engines specifically, or both engines and transmissions?
Engine, transmission, transfer case, differentials, the entire powertrain. And I do cater more towards improving things, but also improving them for a performance aspect. Most of what I do are people looking to go faster or get into some level of motorsport. But yeah, that is what I've been doing for quite a while now. I really enjoy it. It's been a good small business for me.
Okay. Yeah. Sometime if you're willing to, I guess we'll see how it goes. Maybe someday you're willing to come on camera, and maybe you'll have some. I know Nate, he's a little different character. He wasn't too shy to come on and has his own website and things. And I think people thought I was sponsoring him, but I was like, or he was sponsoring me, but I didn't have any relationship like that. I just think it's,
Sure.
hey, if people have the knowledge and they can explain why they've done things, I think it's great for the community and people that want to spend the money to upgrade and have reliable vehicles. It's fun to, sometimes it's a hobby, for folks they buy these brand new trucks and they spend $4,000 on a lift kit. I mean, they'd gladly spend $1,000 to upgrade their valve body. So
Absolutely. You should see what people spend on their diesel pickups. Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks, Cello. I appreciate it. And yeah, we'll hopefully we'll be able to we'll get a load of questions and we'll see how this video does.
Sure. And thank you. And anytime.
All right. Take care.
Take care.